Okay, so hopefully you've all taken this survey. Why do plants make stems? You get a lot of really cool answers like this, like that the stems are what connect the leaves and the roots. I really like that answer. It's kind of zen. But one thing we're thinking about is that there are 20,000 species of bryophytes, right? These are things like liverworts and mosses that they've survived on Earth for 600 million years with essentially without stems. Right? They basically just, if you're a liverwort, you're only a leaf that's just flat against the ground. And if you're a moss, you're basically only leaves as well. So again, why have a stem? It doesn't seem to be necessary to be a photosynthetic organism. The answer that most people, most scientists, most ecologists think is that stems are only useful to be taller than your neighbors, right? Which sounds an awful lot like a game to me. And another thing that I think isn't as well appreciated is the fact that leaves have a role in competition as well too, right? The more leaves I have above you, the more I can shade you. And roots play a role in that too, right? The more roots I have, the more I can steal nutrients away from you. So it's important to remember that, or to realize, what I want you to realize is that trees go differently in the presence of competitors, right? So if I asked you or almost anyone to draw me a picture of a tree, you would probably draw something like this. But this is sort of what we're used to seeing in cities, right? In the middle of a park, you see a nice tree with a stem and a big round ball of leaves. And city trees rarely have competitors, right? But if we went out to a forest and we cut down every tree in the forest except one, what you would see is trees that look much more like this, right? That they have a bunch of shallow roots along the surface, and that they're very much taller, and that they have sort of all their leaves up at the top, right? So a forest tree, what trees are adapted for, look an awful lot like this. And you can capture this. So here's a painting by a famous Canadian painter called Emily Carr, and she was really sort of at the turn of the 20th century. She was really concerned by a lot of the logging that was happening in British Columbia, and so she was really struck by these sort of bleak landscapes, and she would paint these trees, the few that were left after the forest had been clear cut, and you can see that she very much captured this tall tree with just a few leaves at the top, like we're talking about. All right, so let's get some definitions. You guys know I like definitions. Competition, we're going to define as it happens when individuals or populations attempt to use the same limiting resource, right? And so the key is that it's going to result in a reduction of fitness due to that shared resource use, right? And so we can stop and we can think for a minute, what are limiting resources for plants? You could probably say some of these out loud in your room right now while you're watching this, right? It's things like light, water, mineral nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc., and possibly even space, right? Because plants are sessile, so once they take up a particular patch of space, they hold that space for a period, although ecologists debate whether or not space should be a resource or not, and you can think about what you think. There's two types of competition that are worth remembering, and then part of the reason there's these two types is because they have different demographic consequences at the population level, right? So intra-specific competition is competition among members of the same species. This is important for population regulation. Remember that whole idea of density dependence. And intra-specific competition has different properties when compared to interspecific competition, which is competition among members of a different species. This becomes important for coexistence, and therefore it's going to be important to understand for our ideas about community ecology. And in addition to there being two main types, intra, which is within a species, and interspecific, which is among species, there are two main mechanisms of competition that plant people like to think about. Exploitation competition occurs sort of indirectly through a common limiting resource, which acts as sort of an intermediate. So for example, if I deplete the amount of resources in the soil, well, then I take that away from your ability to have it, right? So simple resource competition would be shading you. So I get all the light and you don't get any. That's why probably stems exist. And exploitation competition is different from interference competition, where there's direct interference between the organisms. So the idea is you actually physically prevent your competitor from accessing that space. And so interference competition is much more easy to picture among animals, right? You could probably picture deers butting heads, or dogs actually fighting. That's a form of interference competition. In plants, the best example is probably a phenomena called allelopathy. So allelopathy is a type of interference competition where some plants actually produce chemicals which are toxic to other plants. So for example, black walnut is a type of tree that produces a compound called jugalone. There's actually a whole class of these sorts of jugalone-like compounds that all behave similarly. And this is exuded, it's sort of exuded from the roots, and it also kind of leaches from the leaves, and when leaves fall in autumn, they decompose and release jugalone, and what it tends to do is it actually kills other plants underneath of black walnut. But most plant competition is exploitation competition. And so allelopathy we think is relatively rare, although it's actually pretty difficult to study. So those are the different types of competition. And in the next video, not surprisingly, we're going to think about competition as a game.